Welcome back. Do you remember the first box that you built? Well, I do because it's this one. As you may know, I haven't been working with wood very long. Over the last several years, I've built some shelves and a table or two, but other than that, I haven't built much, and I realized I'd never built a box before. The reason we ended up needing this box or wanting it is because, see the little wicker basket that I've set there in front of it? That's what we used to have some blankets in at the end of our sofa. We had two of those little wicker baskets sitting there, and they only held like two little blankets apiece. And my wife said, man, that would sure be nice if we had a bigger container that would sit there and look nice. Maybe we should go shopping for one. And I said, could I build one? And she was like, oh yeah, why don't you build one? So I did. And of all the projects I've ever done, I recorded more footage for this one than for any other. But of the 2 or 3 hours of footage, I'm going to condense it down to just a few minutes and show you only the interesting parts of how I went about this. One interesting thing about this box is that I didn't use any fasteners. No screws, no nails, just glue and dowels. That was a personal challenge that I set for myself. As always, I began by sketching out a plan here in my little notebook with some dimensions. In my experience, I don't need the plans to be exact, but I need them to be close. I need them to give me an idea of where I'm going to make my cuts and how I'm going to attach things together. In this case, I decided ahead of time that I was going to put some holes in the sides. Partially that was so the blankets could breathe, so there wouldn't be stuffy underneath there, especially if I later added a lid. And also I figured it might remove some weight from it if we ever needed to move that box around. And when I was trying to figure out how to attach the sides to the bottom and what the bottom would rest on, I adjusted my plan by adding this little 1x1 dowel, I guess, or a square dowel underneath there as kind of a underneath the runners. And I decided that I would have the floor of it raised up a little bit, so only the sides of the box would be sitting on the ground. That way I figured I could drill some holes in the bottom, again, to remove a little bit of weight, but also so the blankets could breathe. There's no reason to show me cutting all the boards, but here is the obligatory shot of me using my circular saw guide that I made myself. It's in a previous video, using it to guide my circular saw across the 1/2 inch plywood that I used. Now you're seeing me sketch out a little bit of a grid on the pieces that I've cut because I wanted to mark where those holes would be. Then I used the automatic center punch to punch the spots where I would start to drill. And I made a mistake here and I accidentally drilled into my tabletop, but then I got a little bit smarter and put it up on risers so that when the drill went through the board, it wouldn't damage my tabletop. I didn't have as good a luck with the Forstner bits as I've seen on other woodworking channels. It did not cut as cleanly. Maybe my Forstner bits aren't up to snuff, as the saying goes. They did tear out quite a bit around the edges of the holes, even though I drilled in a little from one side and a little from the other side to avoid that exact problem. I did experience tear out, and that caused the final product to not look perfect, but it does look like I made it. And on the bottom of the box, instead of drilling the same size and shape of holes that I had on the sides, I decided to go with a pattern. My wife's name starts with M, and my first initial is W, which is the same letter, just upside down. So I decided to make an M or W, depending on which side of this board you look at it from, or which direction you're looking at the bottom of the box from. And I made the shape of the letter out of holes. Here you can see the grid that I've drawn. And here I am drilling out the pilot holes for the M and or W. And I went through both sides of the boards, then I switched to a bigger bit. I eventually started using a spade bit, which ended up making cleaner holes than the Forstner bits did, which surprised me based on all the advice that I've been given here on YouTube. Either way, I knew I was going to have to smooth and sand out these holes when I was done. Here you can see me using a small file with a curved back, kind of rubbing it up and down in each hole, all the way around each hole from both sides of the board. And that was just to remove the biggest parts of the, I guess it's called tear out, where the little pieces of the plywood shell splinter up from the drilling process. And I ended up not having enough wood in the end to make one, I forget it was the front or the back of this box. It depends on which direction it's facing. So what I did was put several pieces together, and it ended up being twice as thick because the pieces didn't quite add up to the shape that I needed. So this piece that you're seeing here is the double thick end of the box that I've glued several misshapen pieces together on one side and non-matching pieces on the other side to make it double thick, but about the size that I needed. And there were, of course, some gaps. And so here I'm sanding off the part where I had filled in with some wood filler and vacuuming up the dust that I created. And then on that double thick piece of board, I did drill holes through both sides, and here I am using my handheld router to, I guess, bevel those edges of those holes. I didn't want them to be sharp holes and catch on blankets. I wanted them to be smooth and kind of inset. In one instance, one of the clamps was in the way of the router, so I had to move and readjust, reposition the clamps in order to finish rounding off the edges of all those holes. I don't know which router is the best because, again, I'm not that terribly experienced, but this router works really well for me. It is a Ryobi, however you say that. It's not that heavy. It seems to function really well. It is incredibly loud and does put out quite a bit of dust. And here's the pattern of holes that I've drawn on a piece of paper to help guide me on one end of the box. It is our last name. This turned out to be the hardest part, and in hindsight, I would not do this part again. I would just do the same 6-hole pattern that I did on the ends. I had to do quite a bit of counting and measuring and marking, and a lot of automatic center punching, and some more sanding, and quite a bit of drilling to get all these holes in the right places to actually look like a word. And then again, try to Forstner bit to get these holes going. With these smaller holes, the Forstner bit worked quite a bit better than it did with the larger holes that I had on the other piece. And here you see me sitting outside with the same shirt that I'm wearing right now as I record this video. So how about that? Quite the coincidence. And what I've done is taken a sheet of sandpaper and rolled it up, kind of like you would roll one of those old-fashioned cigarettes, and I'm just running it back and forth through each hole, and then shaving off the still rough edges around the sides of each hole. And this is after I had gone through the file that you saw in the previous footage. This took quite a bit of time, over multiple days, to come through both sides, and it took several sheets of sandpaper, because when you roll it, it crinkles, and on those crinkles, it's not really smooth anymore, and it doesn't roll in a perfect curve, so you're not getting as much of the surface as you would like. But with some patience and persistence, I eventually got the edges of those holes smoothed out. Now, these are those 1x1 wooden square dowels that I talked about for the runners, and also the main reason that I added them was as attachment points for the sides to the bottom. And I decided to use wooden dowels to hold those on. It took me quite a bit of time to figure out how to do this. Lots of measuring, lots of marking. I also had to use a little stopper on the drill bit because I didn't want to go all the way through. Although in hindsight, it probably wouldn't have been a problem had I gone all the way through both boards and then shaved off the dowels from both sides. And then this is the preparation for the glue up. You can see that I have some dowels in place in the side of the box, and I'm putting some glue around the dowels and some glue on the wooden runner, and then clamping it in place. And this was perhaps the hardest part for me, and the part that required parallel clamps, because I had to set the two sides and rest them on those parallel clamps while I got the bottom piece put in place, trying to figure out how to get where to set everything while I put the glue on, and then putting some weights in there to hold it down because I don't have any way to clamp the middle there. So maybe I should have put the runners on the bottom first and then attached the sides. I don't know, but this worked well. It just took some time, and it took some figuring out. And here I have not attached the sides. I've just wedged them in place to see how it's going to look. Gluing the ends in place was definitely a chore. And it did require, again, the parallel clamps. And I also used some of those right angle corner clamps. Now, that one end piece that I talked about that I had glued a bunch of basically scraps together in order to form a board that was the right size, it turned out to be not exactly the right size to fit in there. And so here I'm using a chisel to scrape off some excess on the edges, using a hammer and a chisel to knock off some excess, and I ended up using my random orbital sander to try to smooth out those edges, as you can see here. This part also took quite a bit of time, and apparently it was just from mismeasuring those scraps when I put all these pieces together to form this makeshift board. But I eventually did get it square and able to fit in the end of the box. Here I'm chiseling off the glue squeeze out that came out the bottom. Of course, I want the bottom of this to be smooth because it is going to be sitting on carpet eventually. And I did not yet have one of those tiny flush cut saws, so I'm using just a regular pull saw here to cut the edges of the dowels off. And then, of course, I will smooth that off with sanding in the end. But then once I got that last end piece glued in there and finished, I gave the whole thing a complete sanding once again. I started putting this polyacrylic clear coat on it, and I did this inside the house because it was starting to get just too cold outside for me to do this kind of thing. It doesn't get that cold that often here, but in this case it was. Also inside, the heater, central heat is constantly blowing, so there was plenty of ventilation. And one of my children held the camera for this video. And one problem I turned out to have with the polyacrylic was that it wouldn't just go into those holes very nicely. So what I ended up doing was taking a dowel and cutting a bunch, dozens of these tiny little pieces that you see me holding in my fingers here, and driving them into each one of those holes that I had just drilled all the way through. So in hindsight, again, I would have stuck with the larger holes like I had on the other side. These tiny holes turned out to be a problem. So I put glue in those holes and drove these dowels in there so that I could put the polyacrylic on from both sides. And later I ended up putting little drops of paint in each one of those minor depressions so it wouldn't just look like dried wood glue. So when you see the final product, it basically looks like this. And much later, long after this video footage was recorded, I did add a lid, but I don't think I have a picture of it anywhere. But it holds about 4 times as many blankets as one of those little wicker baskets that you saw at the beginning, or twice as many blankets as the 2 wicker baskets together. So anyway, that's my first box. I'm happy with it. I know it's not perfect, but again, the imperfections, each one has a story. Whether it was the Forstner bits causing more tear out than I expected, or whether it was me not measuring or counting the material that I began with and deciding not to go buy another whole nother sheet of plywood and just gluing some scraps together to make that one end. So those imperfections are obvious as well, but it's mine and I made it, and I did it without any metal fasteners, which I'm pretty impressed with myself. I think it's the first time I've ever built anything without any metal fasteners, just dowels and wood glue, and it holds blankets. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.